Hi, this is Paul. By now, I've released the critique of Keith Wood's wokeism and transhuman future video, which I thought was a very interesting video. I thought there were a lot of interesting ideas in there, and I wanted to respond to it, so I made a commentary video on that video. I did my question and answer this morning on the Bridges Meaning Discord server, and talked about, and part of the reason I do this is language emerges when I talk about these things, and basically, this morning, the way I phrased it is that you are my third hemisphere. Someone, someone in the, I often go through and check the live chat, which I can't look at when I'm doing the question and answer, or otherwise I'll be just totally distracted. Is this the way Paul gives compliments to his wife? Someone basically said, it's like, yeah, Paul's kind of that bad with some compliments, but that's what happens with these videos, and that I think out loud, and the thinking out loud and the talking out loud in the process generates new languages, new metaphors, new images. And so one of the things that came out quite strongly in the commentary on Keith Wood's wokeism and our transhuman future, in that video, there's very much the strain that in what I call progressive liberationism, the goal is to transcend our physicality. Now, what's behind that, I think, is this enduring two worlds mythology. That's one way to talk about it. That's not exactly what John Vervaeke is talking about with respect to a two worlds mythology, but this enduring, there's an upper and a lower register with respect to human beings. And I think this is essential to who and what human beings are, that we are the breath of God and the stuff of earth. And this is very old, and I think, as Machu Picchu's book on Genesis talks about, that's very much who we are. And so much of these mappings, these dualities map so consistently in certain ways, but yet flexibly also, that so much of human philosophical thought about who and what we are is tied to this. Now, this is part of the Vervaeke-Peugeot conversation about emanation versus emergence. This is very dynamic, and it has to do with source. The mappings of the two worlds is an essential aspect of humanity. Now from below, this can be seen as a product of McGilchrist's thesis. Now, remember that these are conceptual reductions of the biological into two hemispheres. There's sort of the right brain, and as John Vervaeke, continues to remind us, don't get too literalistic in this. This is a conceptual framework that McGilchrist is doing. There's the right brain, which is open, intuitive mind that continues to receive data from unmapped territory. The left brain is rational, specific, capturing. It tries to take all of this open stuff and nail it down into manipulables. Things that, my wife is a grade school teacher, and you have, remember homeschooling our kids, you had why can't I say that word? Manipulatables. Was that it? I don't know. Anyway, if you want to teach counting, have little things around that they can count, and then you can put them together. We had all these blocks when we're teaching the kids early math, and we did Singapore math and homeschooling. And so then the kids have all of these illustrations, and it usually starts by story problems, and it takes these things in the world and you sort of build up from there. Well, that's very left brain. It's capturing, it's reducing, it's rationality, a mapping mind that nails things down into discrete causes, facts, etc., processes for those of you in Canada. And so now this again is a conceptual reduction of what's going on, but I think it's a powerful, helpful, and important one. Generally speaking, the two worlds mapping looks like this. From above, you have heaven, spirit, mind, eternality, and always. And from below, you have earth, flesh, matter, change or decay, and now. And although now is a really tricky thing, because in some ways now and eternal eternal is now is a really tricky thing and difficult thing to think about. But for us, now is very contextual and right here. So maybe I should get rid of that word. But these two worlds mappings are really foundational, and we never seem to escape them. But if you understand these two worlds mappings, a lot of other things make sense, like trying to discern and nail down in a very left-brained way what is going on as new religious systems emerge. And so that's what that video on wokeism and our transhuman future is really about. As I say many times, now consciousness, I think of consciousness like a field. And this is a picture. I had a synodical deputy trip to Denver, and so I had a rental car and a few free hours. I usually try and buffer some space in if I can do a meetup or something like that. And so I didn't have a meetup, so I grabbed that car and buzzed out to Rocky Mountain National Park and had my camera and took a lot of pictures and had a fun time. And there were some elk in a field. And so here's one of the pictures that I took. Now, consciousness is like a field. It's just kind of out there. It's kind of a view. And it's monofocal in that it's a view. But now things come into that view, and then consciousness sort of, focuses in and out. So if I show you this picture, you see the field, and then you see the elk. And so monofocal's first tool to manage complexity is duality. And so, we see the field and the elk. And then when we look at the dormant grass, then we see the grass and the elk. I mean, we just keep doing these dualities because monofocality first manages plurality or complexity with duality, because there's only two things. And it's sort of like task flipping back and forth and back and forth. We reduce the world into opposites in order to make it manageable. There's elk and not elk. There's grass and not grass. And it's very basic, but it seems to be the way we begin. Once you try to keep focus on three things at once, the system sort of hits its limit. And I think that's part of why 3 is so powerful. It's sort of beyond what we can manage in this conceptual frame. And that's where you sort of get frozen eternality because of this limit. Now, in the book of Ecclesiastes, there's this really fun little phrase: God has placed eternity in the hearts of man. And that's a rather common English rendering. It's not necessarily a terribly easy thing to render. But I remember, so this is a picture of myself and my wife. I don't think we were even engaged at this point. I think we were just going out. I was in college. We were both in college. And just way to the left of us, you can see my grandmother's chin and nose and glasses. And that's the grandmother who said to me once when I was visiting her, she lived very close to the college that I was going to, and I'd walk over and I'd visit my grandpa and grandma in their retirement community. And I remember once she said to me, I look into the mirror. Well, when I think about who I am, I haven't aged since I was 20 or 21. And when I look in the mirror, I wonder, where did that old woman come from? And so you have this duality in us of an ageless thing and this aging thing. And our ageless thing, so over the years I thought about this, and in many ways I am an eternal story. Stories don't age. Now, sometimes we say that story hasn't aged well, but that's a metaphor because forms don't age, love doesn't decay, ideas don't decay, language doesn't decay. I mean, on and on and on. There's all this mind, heaven, spirit, mind stuff that does not decay. And so, as my grandmother noted, inside she's not decaying like she is on the outside. And when I look at this picture of myself and my wife, I showed this picture to my kids, and my kids are like, because they mostly remember me. They've got some memories of me when I had more hair, and they've got memories of me when my hair was a little bit darker, but they have zero memory of me looking like, how old was I there? Let's see, how old I might have been 22, 23 there. Trying to do some math, remember what year I met my wife. So I met my wife spring of 84. We started dating spring of 85. So yeah, we're in mid 80s land here. And so 85, I was, 21 going on 22, and my wife was 3 years younger than me. So, we're kids, but inside, I still feel like that kid. And every now and then, now that I sit in front of this strange contraption and look at myself in a camera and see myself on screens, it's like, what happened to me? The story doesn't age. The body ages. There's a real duality going on there that I live in the midst of. The upper register doesn't age. It doesn't decay. It's beyond the age of decay. This lower part of me decays and grows a white beard instead of a brown beard, and loses his hair. And, my wife, my kids have a hard time recognizing my wife from those pictures. Everything here below changes, decays, ends. And the Greeks were very aware of this. And, well, how do we manage this? Well, one of the questions is what is the self and what is the location of the self? Now, I'm going to read from the book of Colossians. Since then, you have been raised with Christ. Now, when you start to read this, it's very weird because he's talking to living people who have not been raised in the way that Jesus was raised, that Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 15. Since then, you have been raised with Christ. Set your hearts on things above. Well, what's he talking about? Things above. Where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. For you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. Now, he's writing to people who are alive in the sense that we understand it. But this talking about them is very strange. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. And so I have all this question about, well, what me are you talking about here, Paul? Aren't I sitting here, perhaps in this house, listening to a letter being read by some prominent person in our little house church here in Colossae? And somehow we're supposed to understand that I've died and been raised and is seated, am hidden in Christ, who is seated at the right hand of God, and Christ, who is your life, appears when you also will appear with him in glory. This is a very strange way of talking to and about people. I remember back in my Tim Keller phase in the early, probably around 2007, 2008, he preached a series on, he preached a sermon on this, and that sermon stuck with me. Therefore, put to death whatever belongs to your earthly nature: sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. Because of these, the wrath of God is coming. You used to walk in these things in the life you once lived, but now you must also rid yourselves of all such things as these: anger, rage, malice, slander, and filthy language from your lips. Do not lie to each other, since you have taken off the old self with its practices. Paul often talks about taking off the old self, putting on the new self. Well, where on earth is this self? Where am I located? How does any of this work? Paul has very clear ideas about this. Now, it's very interesting in that Jordan Peterson conversation with the two theologians. The one theologian comments that if you had asked Augustine about identity, he wouldn't have known what you're talking about. Whereas when we think about identity, we very much think about passages like this. It's quite clear that there's been a lot of development in terms of thinking about identity. What is our identity? And that now has become a field upon which a lot of this mapping has occurred. Here there is no Gentile or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave or free, but Christ is all and is in all. And again, watch that Peugeot video on transcendence and immanence. So there's a ton going on here that the church has been working on for a very long time. And you can see how, well, it can easily get involved with a lot of what's going on in that wokeism in our transhuman future. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since you as members of one body. Now first, our life is in heaven, hidden in Christ, going to be revealed in glory because we've died with him and been raised with him. And now we're members of one body. You were called to peace. I mean, we're just switching back and forth very quickly. And be thankful. Let the message of Christ dwell among you richly as you teach and admonish one another with all wisdom through psalms, hymns, and songs from the Spirit, singing to God with gratitude in your hearts. And whatever you do, whether in word or deed, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. So, wow, where and what on earth are we? And this splitness that we have, how does this work? Well, what we're seeing right now is this crisis of the postmodern self. Modernity sort of let the self alone. And as I think some of the good videos about the meaning crisis show, we believed ourselves sort of this island of agency and consciousness in the midst of a very dead world. Eventually, we began not only to deconstruct the world, but when finally those tools were turned on us, we began to deconstruct ourselves, and that is a big piece of the meaning crisis. The spirit of geometry outside led to the crisis of the spirit on the inside. Now, I often talk about the secret sacred self, and what we're seeing is, we're seeing questions about what is the self. And I thought of, again, it was through making these videos that I came up with that language of the secret sacred self, because when someone says something like, I'm a man born in a woman's body, what on earth does that mean? Now, if you read Colossians, that isn't necessarily alien in terms of splitness, but it's certainly not what Paul is talking about. So how does this work? Well, the materialist buffered self is messing with the mapping. Now, the buffered self is the way Charles Taylor talked about part of what happens in the secular age, that unlike the pre-modern age where the self is vulnerable to the spirits, now the buffered self is sort of this island of autonomy, and there are no spirits or gods. It's similar to what I call the iron box of secularism. But what has happened with the meaning crisis and modernity once we began deconstructing the self is that the self becomes fictitious. illusory. Now, again, there are other religious traditions that have for a long time, in many ways, seen the self as illusory and fictitious. I think many of those philosophies arose in far more deeply communitarian cultures where, and I think this is actually quite widespread, where in fact your identity was received from your group and you didn't have to achieve it personally and therefore express it. So the self is fictitious and illusory. Now, we in an individualist culture find that deeply unsatisfying and unsettling. That, well, the meaning crisis means maybe I don't exist. There is no me. All there is the machine out there and the machine in here are both the same, in sort of the way that Galileo said, well, what goes on beyond the moon up in the heavenlies is the same as what goes on down here below. And so this discarded image had to be discarded because the math works better in both realms. So once the self is fictitious, well, the self is going to assert itself, but it's going to need a location for itself. Part of what happens in modernity is that the deconstruction of the self leaves no self at all. Now, ancient solutions tended to be communitarian, and your identity was with the group or given to you from some divine being. So in that way, we can see Paul as conversant in much more ancient ways of figuring out the self. In individualism, the self is sacred. And that's when we get into all of this frame language. Again, when I was listening to Benjamin Boyce talk to James Lindsay about how, and I was thinking about the frame problem a lot then, I'd made a video about this, God is the frame of frames. Your frame is the one thing you don't deconstruct, because if you deconstruct your frame very quickly, you're without orientation and you dissolve. So you need a frame. And the frame is almost by definition that which is sacred, because sacred is the thing you don't touch. Sacred is the thing that gives orientation around everything else. But one human being is a very shallow pond. And as we are seeing, one human being isn't necessarily one identity. And so when we have the indeterminate plural, such as if I'm driving a car and I just see a shadowy figure in the car in front of me and they cut me off, I use they, even though it's one person, instead of he or she, because I don't know the gender of the person. So I switch to the indeterminate. But I think part of what we're seeing is that there's an indeterminacy of identity. And so we're locating that as gender fluid, but it should probably be identity fluid. Now, there shouldn't be any stigma attached to this, because anyone who has passed through adolescence in the Western world knows that we try on a lot of identities. And in fact, Jordan Peterson, when commenting on his granddaughter who preferred to identify as Pocahontas, was trying on an identity. And so for much of our life, we try on identities and we have different transformations. We see that, in fact, in the Apostle Paul, who had a rather important transformation that happens on the road to Damascus. So actually, individual identity that is singular is an achievement, and we call that integrity. And so when we watch individuals insist that they be spoken of as a plurality, this shouldn't really surprise us. And it's something we're going to have to figure out what to do with. Now, how this works, though, with identity in yourself, well, with the secret sacred self, you kind of become your own private heaven. This is where the self has retreated to, and it's in many ways the divination of the self. But you are estranged and alienated. You are estranged and alienated from yourself. And so what life becomes is the search for reintegration of the self. Now, in the Keith Wood video where he talks about Gnosticism, I can very much understand why he's using that word. Because Gnosticism is one of many, if we can use that to describe maybe only a pattern of subcommunities that participate in certain patterns. Gnosticism is one of these many permutations of asking hard questions about reality. Rationality Rules has been doing videos on Jordan Peterson again, which means that YouTube serves them up to me, which means I watch his videos, which means I want to respond to them. We'll see if I do. So this alienation, and now, in many ways we're barking up the tree of existentialism here, but you are alienated from yourself, your true self. And if you look at the George Yancey, Sean McDowell conversation on George Yancey's One Faith No More, one of the things that George Yancey notes is that progressive Christians have sort of switched from sort of orienting, not all, of course, but orienting the true self as Christ and just having a true self. And once your journey is the quest for that true self, and almost everything is fluid, well, I can aspire to be Shirley Temple. Not Shirley Temple Black and her story, but the young Shirley Temple who sang and danced. And why I pick Shirley Temple, not because I have a desire to sing and dance, because I don't do either of them very well, but because it's so exactly opposite of who I am physically and now chronologically. Life is your journey to discover, express, and live your true self or your best life now. You will hear this language all over the place. And Christians have very much picked it up and use it. And I'll use it sometimes too, if I want to get a point across. But in Christianity, if we read the book of Colossians, there's an orientation in this dual register system that locks us onto Christ. You are different from your true self, being in Christ and arriving with the eschaton. That, again, if you read Colossians, there's a whole framework in there in Christianity, which now it's just sort of out there. And so people's true selves are this and that and this and that. The problem that they face is life is short, and if there isn't a fair amount of stability to the self, well, that's going to make having productive, stable relationships with others very, very difficult. Purity is all egoic will and desire. Now, purity, I mean attaining purely, ideally, that true self. It has to be located and expressed here below. Well, it's sort of located above and expressed here below. The problem that you have with secularism, and also, there's a lot of Christianity in this, because if you begin the Lord's Prayer, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done in heaven and on earth. The two ranges. If it's all got to be within your lifetime, it has to come ASAP, and you're always striving for it. And what's peculiar about the present version of it is, of course, this has all happened in many ways after the development of social sciences, and there's a real sort of convenient forgetfulness about social sciences, because Social science is supposed to be all about the deconstruction of the individual in a scientific way through the spirit of geometry. And suddenly the secret sacred self, again, it has to be sacred. It's secret because we don't know it, but that somehow is not subject to social science. And so it sort of becomes a solipsistic heaven. But our salvation comes from social engineering. Hauntings of the constructed self. Navigationally, it comes from sort of a solipsistic heaven. And so again, I think understanding these registers helps understand how wokeism works and why I don't think wokeism, I think it's going to continue to evolve. Because as it's presently imagined, it's just not very serious. It's not going to be very durable. It's got so much code sort of haphazardly borrowed from Christianity and from many other things that I don't think it will actually work in people's lives. And I think part of the reason Jordan Peterson, the way he frames what an ideology is as opposed to a religion, it's not battle tested, it's not time tested, it's not community sourced or oriented. There hasn't been enough wisdom in it. It's just really not going to last. That doesn't mean that it won't do a lot of damage. It doesn't mean that a lot of people won't be hurt. It doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that it's something we shouldn't be concerned about. But it's all about the bindings of these registers. The history of ideas for humanity is in some ways continually working on this duality. And I mapped it out. You have heaven, spirit, mind, earth, flesh, matter, these two registers. And you can't lose these with human beings, or in a sense, you lose exactly what humanity is. In biblical language, the stuff of earth and the breath of God. And we're constantly trying to figure out how in detail that plays out in this world. Now, the Bible ends with the reunion of heaven and earth, God and humanity, now and always, etc., etc. That's the end of the story. And again, in sort of Barfieldian, you have original participation, a loss of participation, final participation. And so you see these things being mapped in certain ways again and again and again. This is an attempt to try to sum up some of these ideas. I don't know if it went very well. You'll let me know in the comments, I'm sure.